I can see you've provided detailed instructions for creating a Gothic romance narrative in American English, along with what appears to be an example story in Portuguese. Let me create the story following your specifications. The candle flame trembled between them, casting shadows that danced like secrets across her pale skin. His voice cut through the silence, low, commanding, dangerous, while her breath caught in her throat like a trapped bird. She stood frozen in the doorway, knowing that whatever words came next would shatter the fragile world she had built from whispers and stolen glances. The air between them pulsed with everything unsaid, everything forbidden, everything that had led to this moment where her heart hammered against her ribs like a prayer she dared not speak. Before we dive into the story, please leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The morning mist clung to Thornfield Manor like grief to a widow's veil, and Clara Ashworth moved through its corridors with the practiced silence of someone who had learned that invisibility was survival. Her footsteps made no sound against the cold stone floors. Her breath formed no clouds in the perpetual chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. She was nothing here, less than the portraits that watched from gilded frames, less than the dust that gathered on surfaces no one bothered to clean in the servants' quarters. The other maids whispered that she was cursed, born to a mother who died screaming her name, raised by an aunt who saw her only as a burden to be endured. Clara had arrived at Thornfield 3 winters ago with nothing but the threadbare dress on her back and eyes the color of storm clouds. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Blackthorne, had made it clear from the first day that charity had its limits, and Clara's place in the household hierarchy was somewhere below the hunting dogs and only slightly above the rats in the cellar. But it was those very eyes, gray as winter dawn, deep as old secrets, that had first caught the attention of Lord Damien Thornfield when he returned from his travels abroad. Clara remembered the moment with crystalline clarity. She had been scrubbing the marble floor of the grand foyer when his boots appeared in her field of vision. Polished black leather, expensive, still bearing traces of foreign dust. She had not dared to look up, but she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, pressing against the crown of her bent head until her hands trembled against the wet stone. "What is your name?" His voice had been velvet over steel, cultured accent wrapped around something darker, more primal. When she finally raised her eyes to meet his, the world had shifted on its axis. Lord Thornfield was not handsome in any conventional sense. His features were too sharp, his jaw too severe, his dark hair worn longer than fashion dictated. But there was something magnetic about him, something that made the air vibrate with an energy she couldn't name. His eyes were black as midnight, and when they fixed on hers, Clara felt as though he could see straight through to her soul. "Clara, my lord," she had whispered, her voice barely audible above the thunder of her own heartbeat. He had nodded once, slowly, as if committing her name to memory, then turned and walked away without another word. But Clara had remained kneeling on the cold marble long after his footsteps faded, her hands pressed against her chest, as if to keep her heart from beating right out of her body. In the weeks that followed, she became acutely aware of his presence in the house. Lord Thornfield moved through Thornfield Manor like a shadow-given substance, appearing and disappearing without warning. Sometimes Clara would turn a corner and find him standing in an alcove, reading a letter by candlelight, his face carved from granite in the flickering glow. Other times she would catch glimpses of him through windows, riding his black stallion across the moors with a recklessness that made her throat tighten with unnamed fear. The other servants gave him a wide berth. Even Mrs. Blackthorne, who ruled the household staff with an iron fist, seemed diminished in his presence. There were rumors, of course, whispered stories about his time in the distant colonies, about business dealings that decent people didn't discuss, about a darkness that clung to him like smoke. But Clara found herself drawn to that darkness rather than repelled by it. When she cleaned his study, she would linger over his personal effects, the leather-bound books filled with languages she couldn't read, the strange artifacts from foreign lands, the letters sealed with black wax that bore no return address. It was Lady Catherine Winfield who first noticed Clara's fascination with the master of the house. Lord Thornfield's cousin had arrived for an extended visit, just as autumn painted the moors in shades of blood and gold, bringing with her a retinue of fashionable friends and an arsenal of cutting remarks designed to remind everyone of their proper place in society's hierarchy. She was beautiful in the way that only money and breeding could create. Golden hair always perfectly arranged, blue eyes like chips of Arctic ice, skin that had never known a day of honest labor. "That little mouse of a housemaid," Lady Catherine had said one evening, her voice carrying clearly through the dining room doors as Clara served the soup course. "She watches you like a lovesick puppy, Damien. It's quite unseemly, really. Perhaps you should have Mrs. Blackthorne speak to her about keeping her eyes to herself." Clara's hands had trembled so violently that she nearly dropped the tureen, but she forced herself to continue serving as if she hadn't heard every poisonous word. When she finally risked a glance at Lord Thornfield, she found him watching her with an unreadable expression, his dark eyes following the movement of her hands as she ladled soup into bone china bowls with painted roses around the rim. "I hadn't noticed," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. But Clara caught the lie in the slight tension around his eyes, and her heart performed a painful somersault in her chest. That night, as she lay on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, Clara stared at the ceiling and tried to convince herself that Lady Catherine was wrong. She wasn't lovesick. She was simply aware of him in a way that defied explanation. When he entered a room, the very air seemed to change, becoming charged with an electricity that made her skin tingle and her breath catch. When he spoke, his voice seemed to resonate somewhere deep in her chest, like the low notes of a church organ. And when those midnight eyes found hers across a crowded room, she felt as though she was drowning in depths she couldn't fathom. But love was for people who had the luxury of choice, who could afford to follow their hearts without counting the cost. Clara was a servant, a nobody, a girl with no family name and no prospects beyond a lifetime of scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots. Whatever she felt for Lord Thornfield was a weakness she couldn't afford, a flame that would only consume her if she let it burn. The first snow fell early that year, blanketing Thornfield Manor in pristine white that made the ancient stone walls look like something from a fairy tale. Clara found herself working longer hours as the household prepared for the Christmas season and the stream of guests who would arrive to celebrate with Lord Thornfield and his cousin. Every room had to be aired and cleaned, every surface polished to a mirror shine, every fireplace stocked with enough wood to keep the autumn chill at bay. It was while preparing the blue guest room that Clara made her first real mistake. She had been dusting the mantelpiece when her elbow caught the edge of a delicate porcelain figurine, a shepherdess with a painted smile and flowing dress that probably cost more than Clara would earn in a year. The figure tumbled to the stone hearth and shattered into a dozen pieces, the sound of breaking porcelain echoing through the room like a gunshot. Clara dropped to her knees, frantically gathering the fragments as if she could somehow piece them back together through sheer force of will. Her hands shook as she picked up each shard, and she was so focused on her task that she didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway until it was too late. "What happened here, Mrs.?" Blackthorne's voice cracked like a whip, and Clara's head snapped up to find the head housekeeper standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and her face set in lines of grim satisfaction. Behind her stood Lady Catherine, resplendent in a morning dress of deep emerald silk, her blue eyes bright with malicious interest. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, the words catching in her throat. "It was an accident. I'll pay for it, I swear. I'll work extra hours, You'll do nothing of the sort," Mrs. Blackthorne interrupted, her voice dripping with disdain. "That figurine belonged to Lord Thornfield's mother. It's irreplaceable, unlike some people in this household." She stepped into the room, her heavy boots crunching on the scattered porcelain. "I've been looking for an excuse to be rid of you, girl. This will do nicely." Clara's world tilted sideways. Without this position, she had nowhere to go, no way to survive the harsh winter that was already settling over the Yorkshire moors. The workhouse was a death sentence for someone like her, and the streets were even worse. "Please," she breathed, the word barely audible. "I'll do anything." "How dramatic," Lady Catherine murmured, gliding into the room like a predatory bird. "Though I suppose it's only natural for her sort to grovel when faced with the consequences of their clumsiness." She picked up one of the larger pieces of the figurine, examining it with the detached interest of someone observing an insect. "Really, Mrs. Blackthorne, I think you're being quite merciful. If she were my servant, I'd have her flogged for destroying such a precious heirloom." The casual cruelty in Lady Catherine's voice hit Clara like a physical blow. She remained kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the evidence of her mistake, and felt something cold and hopeless settle in her chest like a stone. This was what her life had always been, one moment of carelessness away from complete ruin, one misstep away from losing everything she had fought so hard to build. "Get out of my sight," Mrs. Blackthorne commanded, her face flushed with righteous anger. "Pack your things, and be gone before the dinner hour. And don't expect a reference. No decent household will have you after this." Clara forced herself to her feet on unsteady legs, her hands still clutching fragments of broken porcelain. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that it truly had been an accident, but she knew that words would only make things worse. Instead, she lowered her eyes and prepared to walk past the two women who held her fate in their perfectly manicured hands. "What exactly is going on here?" The voice that cut through the tension was dark as midnight and twice as dangerous. Lord Thornfield stood in the doorway, filling the frame with his imposing presence, his black eyes taking in the scene with predatory intensity. He was dressed for riding, his tall boots and dark coat still bearing traces of morning mist, and there was something in his expression that made both Mrs. Blackthorne and Lady Catherine take an unconscious step backward. "My lord," Mrs. Blackthorne began, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence, "this clumsy girl has broken your mother's figurine. I was just telling her." "I can see what you were telling her." Lord Thornfield's gaze moved from the broken porcelain to Clara's pale face, then back to Mrs. Blackthorne with a coldness that could have frozen blood. "And I can see that you were enjoying it rather more than necessary." He stepped into the room, and Clara caught the scent of leather and pine and something darker that made her pulse quicken despite her terror. "Leave us." "But my lord," Lady Catherine protested, her perfect composure finally showing cracks. "Surely you don't mean to. I believe I spoke clearly enough." Lord Thornfield's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Leave us." Mrs. Blackthorne gathered what remained of her dignity and swept from the room, her face mottled with suppressed rage. Lady Catherine hesitated for a moment longer, her eyes moving between Clara and Lord Thornfield with something that might have been understanding dawning in their blue depths. Then she too departed, her silk skirts rustling like autumn leaves. Clara remained frozen in place, still holding the broken pieces of porcelain, hardly daring to breathe. Lord Thornfield moved closer, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet, until she could feel the heat radiating from his body despite the chill in the air. When he spoke again, his voice was so soft she had to strain to hear it. "Look at me, Clara." The command was gentle but absolute, and Clara found herself obeying before her rational mind could intervene. When her eyes met his, she saw something there that made her heart stutter in her chest. Not anger, not disappointment, but something infinitely more dangerous. Something that looked almost like protection. "Give me your hands," he said, and Clara realized she was still clutching the porcelain fragments so tightly that they were cutting into her palms. Without thinking, she held out her hands, and Lord Thornfield carefully pried her fingers open, his touch sending shock waves through her entire body. Blood welled from several small cuts, bright red against her pale skin, and he made a soft sound of disapproval deep in his throat. "You're hurt," he murmured, his dark eyes focused on her injured hands with an intensity that made Clara's knees weak. "This is unacceptable." "I'm fine," Clara whispered, though they both knew it was a lie. Nothing about this situation was fine. Not the broken figurine, not her impending dismissal, and certainly not the way Lord Thornfield was looking at her as if she were something precious rather than something expendable. "No," he said quietly, his thumbs tracing across her palms with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such strong hands. "You're not fine, and neither is this." He raised his eyes to meet hers again, and Clara saw something there that made her forget how to breathe. "You will not be dismissed. You will not be punished. And anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally." The words hung in the air between them like a promise, or perhaps a threat. Clara stared at him in shock, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. In her experience, lords didn't protect housemaids. They used them, discarded them, forgot they existed. But Lord Thornfield was looking at her as if she mattered, as if her pain was his concern, as if her fate was somehow intertwined with his own. "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, barely more than a breath against the charged silence. Lord Thornfield was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession. "Because you deserve better than this," he said simply. "Because you've done nothing to warrant such cruelty. And because—" He paused, his jaw tightening, as if the next words cost him something. "Because I cannot bear to see you hurt." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, truly seen, by someone who mattered. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. For the first time in her life, someone was choosing to protect her rather than use her. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for everything she was feeling, but all she could manage through the tightness in her throat. Lord Thornfield released her hands slowly, as if reluctant to break the connection between them. "Go to the kitchen," he said quietly. "Have cook tend to your cuts. Then return to your duties as if nothing happened. And Clara!" He waited until her eyes met his again. "If anyone gives you trouble about this, anyone at all, you come to me. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She gathered her skirts and moved toward the door on unsteady legs, hyper-aware of his eyes following her every movement. At the threshold, she paused and looked back to find him standing amid the scattered fragments of his mother's figurine, his dark hair falling across his forehead and his expression unreadable in the morning light. "My lord," she ventured, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I truly am sorry. About the figurine." A smile ghosted across his lips, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his entire face from something forbidding into something breathtakingly beautiful. "It was only a thing, Clara," he said softly. "Things can be replaced. People cannot." Clara fled then, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the manor could hear it. She made her way to the kitchen in a daze, barely aware of cook's gentle ministrations as the older woman cleaned and bandaged her cuts. All she could think about was the way Lord Thornfield had looked at her, the way his voice had softened when he spoke her name, the way his hands had cradled hers as if she were made of spun glass rather than common clay. But it was Lady Catherine's reaction that truly frightened her. When Clara returned to her duties that afternoon, she found her employer's cousin waiting in the hallway like a spider in her web, blue eyes glittering with a malice that made Clara's blood run cold. "How very interesting," Lady Catherine murmured, her voice silk wrapped around steel. "It seems my cousin has developed a protective instinct toward the help. How wonderfully noble of him." She stepped closer, and Clara caught the scent of expensive perfume underlaid with something rotten. "But you shouldn't mistake his momentary kindness for anything more significant, little mouse. Men like Damien don't marry girls like you. They use them, discard them, and move on to more suitable prey." The words hit their mark with surgical precision, and Clara felt her newfound hope crumble like ash in her hands. Lady Catherine was right, of course. Whatever had passed between her and Lord Thornfield in that room was an aberration, a moment of weakness that would be forgotten as soon as more pressing matters claimed his attention. She was still nothing, still a servant, still disposable, still alone. "I don't know what you mean, my lady," Clara managed, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. Lady Catherine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Of course you don't, dear. How foolish of me to suggest otherwise." She leaned closer, her breath hot against Clara's ear. "But just remember, I'll be watching you very carefully from now on. And if I see even a hint of you forgetting your place again—" She didn't finish the threat, but she didn't need to. The promise of consequences hung in the air between them like a blade. Clara curtsied and escaped before Lady Catherine could say anything else that might shatter what remained of her composure. But as she went about her duties for the rest of the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted at Thornfield Manor. The careful balance that had allowed her to survive here for 3 years was beginning to crack, and she had no idea what would emerge from the ruins. That night, as snow continued to fall beyond her tiny window, Clara lay in her narrow bed and replayed every moment of her encounter with Lord Thornfield. She traced the bandages on her palms and remembered the gentle weight of his hands, the dark intensity of his eyes, the way her name had sounded on his lips like a prayer. It was dangerous to remember, dangerous to hope, dangerous to want things that were so far beyond her reach they might as well have been on the moon. But as sleep finally claimed her, Clara couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to be protected, to be valued, to be loved by someone who saw her as more than just another piece of furniture in his grand house. It was a foolish dream, she knew, the kind that led to heartbreak and ruin. But for just one night, she allowed herself to imagine a world where fairy tales came true and servant girls could capture the hearts of dark, mysterious lords. She had no way of knowing that in his own chambers, Lord Damien Thornfield was lying awake with thoughts that mirrored her own, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand why the image of tears in storm-gray eyes had the power to undo everything he thought he knew about himself. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A messenger arrived before dawn with word that Lord Thornfield's business partner in London had died suddenly, leaving behind a tangle of investments that required immediate attention. Within hours, the master of Thornfield Manor was preparing to depart for the city, his plans for a quiet winter in Yorkshire abandoned in favor of damage control and legal proceedings that could take months to resolve. Clara learned of his departure the way she learned most things at Thornfield, through whispered conversations between the other servants, fragments of information pieced together from overheard discussions and discarded correspondence. She was polishing silver in the dining room when Mrs. Blackthorne announced to the assembled staff that Lord Thornfield would be leaving within the hour, and that they were expected to maintain the household in his absence with the same dedication they showed when he was in residence. The head housekeeper's eyes found Clara during the speech, and the malicious gleam there made it clear that she had not forgotten or forgiven the previous day's events. Without Lord Thornfield's protection, Clara would once again be at the mercy of a woman who had made no secret of her desire to see her gone. But it was Lady Catherine's reaction that truly set Clara's nerves on edge. Rather than expressing disappointment at her cousin's departure, she seemed almost pleased by the development, as if his absence created opportunities she had been waiting for. She spent the morning in her chambers, writing letters and receiving visitors who spoke in hushed tones about matters that were clearly not meant for servants' ears. Clara didn't see Lord Thornfield before he left. She was scrubbing the back stairs when she heard the sound of carriage wheels on gravel, and by the time she reached a window that faced the front drive, his coach was already disappearing into the morning mist like something from a dream. The sight of that empty road hit her harder than she had expected, and she pressed her forehead against the cold glass as a loneliness deeper than any she had ever known settled in her chest. Without his presence to anchor it, Thornfield Manor seemed to transform overnight into something colder and more hostile. Mrs. Blackthorne's cruelties became more pointed, her criticisms more frequent. The other servants, sensing the shift in power, began to distance themselves from Clara as if her misfortune might be contagious. And Lady Catherine began to pay attention to Clara in ways that made her skin crawl with apprehension. It started with small things, requests for Clara to serve at dinner parties where she was clearly out of place, assignments that kept her working in areas where Lady Catherine's friends would be sure to see her, comments made just loudly enough for Clara to overhear about the amusing presumptions of the servant class. Each incident was carefully crafted to humiliate without providing grounds for complaint, a masterclass in subtle torture that left Clara feeling raw and exposed. But it was the night of Lady Catherine's Christmas ball that everything finally came to a head. The entire manor had been transformed for the occasion, every surface gleaming with candlelight and gold, every room filled with the cream of Yorkshire society. Clara had been assigned to work in the ladies' retiring room, helping guests with their wraps, and attending to any needs that might arise during the evening's festivities. She was arranging fresh flowers when Lady Catherine entered with two of her closest friends, women whose names Clara didn't know, but whose disdain for anyone beneath their social station was immediately apparent. They spoke as if Clara were invisible, their conversation flowing around her like water around a stone. "The most amusing thing happened last week," Lady Catherine was saying, her voice bright with malicious amusement. "My cousin's little pet housemaid had the audacity to break a priceless family heirloom, and when Mrs. Blackthorne moved to dismiss her, Damien actually intervened on her behalf. Can you imagine? As if a man of a standing should concern himself with the fate of such a creature." One of her companions, a thin woman with sharp features and calculating eyes, laughed behind her fan. "How very democratic of Lord Thornfield." though I suppose even the most refined gentleman can be moved to pity when faced with a pretty face and a tragic story. Oh, but that's just it, Lady Catherine continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried more clearly than a shout. She's not even particularly pretty. Rather plain, actually, in that pitiful way that some men find appealing. All wide eyes and trembling lips, as if she's perpetually on the verge of tears. I suspect she's been practicing the look in her mirror, hoping to catch someone's attention through manufactured vulnerability. The words hit Clara like physical blows, each one precisely calculated to find the soft spots in her already fragile self-esteem. She kept her eyes fixed on the flowers she was arranging, her hands steady despite the way her heart was shattering in her chest. She had always known this was how people like Lady Catherine saw her, as something pitiful and grasping, a creature so desperate for affection that she would manufacture tragedy to garner sympathy. How dreadfully manipulative, the third woman observed, her tone suggesting that manipulation was a sin far worse than cruelty, though I suppose one can hardly blame her for trying. It must be terrifying to face a lifetime of servitude without any hope of improvement. Precisely, Lady Catherine agreed, and Clara could hear the smile in her voice, which is why it's so important to ensure that such ambitions are properly discouraged before they can take root. Servants who forget their place can become quite troublesome if allowed to believe their betters might actually care about their feelings. Clara's hands stilled on the flowers, a terrible understanding beginning to dawn in her mind. This conversation wasn't taking place in her presence by accident. It was a performance designed specifically for her benefit, a carefully orchestrated reminder of exactly how little she mattered to people like them. Lady Catherine had planned this moment, chosen her words with surgical precision to inflict maximum damage. I do hope Lord Thornfield's momentary lapse of judgment hasn't given her any unfortunate ideas, one of the friends murmured. It would be quite tragic if she began to imagine herself as anything more than what she is. Oh, I think we can trust her to remember her proper place, Lady Catherine replied, her voice carrying a weight of certainty that made Clara's blood freeze. After all, reality has a way of reasserting itself, doesn't it? And the reality is that men like my cousin don't fall in love with servants, no matter how convincingly they play the role of damsel in distress. The conversation continued, but Clara could no longer hear the words over the roaring in her ears. Each casual cruelty was a knife between her ribs, each dismissive laugh a reminder that she had been foolish to hope for anything more than the life she had been born to. Lord Thornfield's protection had been nothing more than a momentary impulse, a gentleman's reflex that would be forgotten as soon as he encountered more pressing concerns. When the ladies finally departed, leaving Clara alone with their lingering perfume and the echoes of their poisonous words, she sank into the nearest chair and pressed her hands to her face. She wouldn't cry, not here, not where someone might see her and report back to Lady Catherine with news of her weakness. But the pain in her chest was so intense she could barely breathe, as if someone had reached inside her and squeezed her heart until it burst. She had been a fool to believe, even for a moment, that someone like Lord Thornfield could care about someone like her. She had been a fool to read kindness into what was merely courtesy, protection into what was merely impulse. She had been a fool to imagine herself as anything more than what Lady Catherine's friends had called her, a pitiful creature grasping for affection from those who would never see her as anything more than furniture. But even as the pain threatened to overwhelm her, Clara felt something else stirring in her chest, something harder and more durable than hope. It was anger, pure and clean and clarifying. Anger at Lady Catherine for her calculated cruelty, anger at Mrs. Blackthorne for her petty tyrannies, and most of all, anger at herself for being weak enough to believe that fairy tales could come true for girls like her. She straightened her shoulders and smoothed her skirts, transforming her face into the placid mask that had served her well for 3 years at Thornfield Manor. If they wanted her to remember her place, she would remember it. If they wanted her to abandon any hope of something better, she would abandon it. But she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of service and silence. Clara performed her duties with mechanical precision, her face a blank canvas that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. When guests complimented her efficiency or thanked her for some small service, she curtsied and murmured appropriate responses without meeting their eyes. When Lady Catherine passed through the retiring room and favored her with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, Clara returned it with a composure that would have done credit to a duchess. But it was only later, when the last guest had departed and the candles had been extinguished, that Clara finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. She climbed the narrow stairs to her tiny room in the servants' quarters and closed the door behind her with hands that trembled only slightly. Then she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and stared at the small window that looked out over the moors, where somewhere in the distance, Lord Thornfield was living his life without giving a second thought to the housemaid he had briefly, inexplicably protected. The snow had stopped falling, and the world beyond her window was pristine and white and utterly silent. It was beautiful in its emptiness, Clara thought, beautiful and cold and perfect, like a fairy tale setting that would never know the warmth of a happy ending. She pressed her palm against the glass and felt the chills seep through her skin, a reminder that some things were too far away to ever be touched. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams of dark eyes and gentle hands, of voices that spoke her name like a prayer and promises that dissolved like mist in the morning light. Clara woke with tears on her cheeks, and the absolute certainty that those dreams were all she would ever have of the man who had, for one brief, shining moment, made her believe she was worth protecting. The weeks that followed were an exercise in endurance. Without Lord Thornfield's presence to moderate the household's atmosphere, Thornfield Manor settled into a rhythm of subtle cruelties and carefully orchestrated humiliations. Mrs. Blackthorne seemed to take particular pleasure in assigning Clara the most unpleasant tasks, scrubbing chamber pots, cleaning out fireplaces, hauling buckets of water up 3 flights of stairs despite the fact that there were younger, stronger girls who could handle such work more easily. But it was Lady Catherine who proved to be the more dangerous adversary. Where Mrs. Blackthorne's persecution was obvious and crude, Lady Catherine's was sophisticated and nearly invisible. She had a gift for creating situations where Clara would be humiliated without anyone being able to point to deliberate malice. A request to serve tea to a room full of guests who would then proceed to discuss the presumptions of the servant class. An assignment to clean the library while Lady Catherine entertained visitors with stories about the amusing delusions of housemaids who forgot their proper station. 100 small cuts that bled in private while leaving no visible wounds. Clara endured it all with the stoic silence that had become her armor. She had learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged more of it, that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, that survival meant becoming smaller and quieter until she was nearly invisible. But even as she submitted to each new humiliation, she held fast to the one thing they couldn't take away from her, the memory of Lord Thornfield's hands cradling hers, his voice speaking her name like it mattered, his eyes seeing her as something more than a convenience to be used or an obstacle to be removed. It was that memory that sustained her through the long winter nights when the cold seemed to seep into her very bones. It was that memory that gave her strength when Lady Catherine's cutting remarks found their mark with surgical precision. And it was that memory that kept her sane when the isolation of her position threatened to crush what remained of her spirit. But memory, Clara was learning, could be both salvation and torment. Every time she allowed herself to remember the warmth in Lord Thornfield's voice, she also had to remember Lady Catherine's words about the reality of her situation. Every time she recalled the gentleness of his touch, she had to acknowledge the gulf that separated a lord from a housemaid. Every time she felt her heart lift at the thought of his return, she had to remind herself that men like him didn't fall in love with girls like her. The letters helped in their way. Lord Thornfield wrote regularly to his cousin, and Clara often saw the heavy cream paper bearing his familiar handwriting when she delivered Lady Catherine's correspondence. She never read them, of course. Such a breach of trust would have cost her position and possibly her freedom, but just seeing his writing was enough to remind her that he existed somewhere beyond the suffocating walls of Thornfield Manor. Lady Catherine seemed to take particular pleasure in reading portions of these letters aloud to her friends, carefully selecting passages that would emphasize Lord Thornfield's absorption in London society and his apparent contentment with city life. "He writes that he's been invited to Lady Pemberton's soiree," she would announce with satisfaction, "and that the Duchess of Whitmore has expressed interest in introducing him to her youngest daughter. How lovely that he's finally taking an active interest in finding a suitable wife." Each such revelation was a fresh wound, But Clara learned to accept them with the same stoic composure she brought to all of Lady Catherine's cruelties. What had she expected? That a man of Lord Thornfield's station would remain unmarried forever? That he would turn down advantageous matches to mourn for a housemaid's broken heart? The idea was so ridiculous that Clara almost laughed, though the sound that escaped her throat was closer to a sob. Spring came late to Yorkshire that year, and with it came news that made Clara's heart stutter in her chest. Lord Thornfield was returning to Thornfield Manor, and he was bringing guests. Important guests whose comfort and entertainment would require every servant in the household to perform their duties with absolute perfection. Mrs. Blackthorne called a meeting of the entire staff to discuss the preparations that would be necessary, her voice sharp with the authority of someone who knew that any failure would reflect poorly on her management. Lord Thornfield will be arriving with Lord and Lady Pemberton and their daughter, she announced, her eyes scanning the assembled servants for any sign of inadequacy. Lady Pemberton is one of the most influential hostesses in London, and Lady Sarah Pemberton is, well, let us simply say that his lordship's future happiness may depend on the impression our household makes during their visit. Clara felt something cold and sharp twist in her stomach at those words. Lady Sarah Pemberton, the daughter Lady Catherine had mentioned in her letters, the suitable bride who would give Lord Thornfield the future that society expected of him. Clara had known this day would come, had prepared herself for it as much as anyone could prepare for heartbreak, but the reality of it was somehow worse than all her imaginings. I trust one need not emphasize the importance of perfect behavior from each and every one of you, Mrs. Blackthorne continued, her gaze lingering meaningfully on Clara. Any servant who embarrasses this household during the Pembertons' visit will find themselves seeking employment elsewhere. Am I understood? A chorus of yes, ma'am rose from the assembled staff, but Clara's voice stuck in her throat. All she could think about was Lord Thornfield returning to Thornfield Manor with his future bride, walking through the halls where Clara had once dared to hope for something more than servitude. The pain was so intense she had to press her hand to her chest to keep from crying out. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Every room was cleaned and polished until it gleamed, every piece of silver buffed to mirror brightness, every flower arrangement perfected and re-perfected until Mrs. Blackthorne was satisfied with the effect. Clara threw herself into the work with desperate intensity, grateful for any distraction from the thoughts that threatened to consume her during quiet moments. But even exhausting physical labor couldn't completely quiet the voice in her head that whispered treacherous possibilities. What if Lord Thornfield had missed her? What if he had thought of her during his long months in London? What if the connection she had felt between them had been real, and not just the product of her lonely imagination? She knew these thoughts were dangerous, knew they would only lead to greater pain when reality inevitably reasserted itself, but she couldn't seem to stop them from coming. The morning of Lord Thornfield's arrival dawned gray and overcast, with clouds that threatened rain and a wind that carried the scent of approaching storm. Clara dressed with extra care, choosing her cleanest apron and making sure her hair was pinned back with mathematical precision. If this was to be the day her dreams died completely, she would at least meet that death with dignity. She was dusting the front hall when the sound of carriage wheels reached her ears. Through the tall windows flanking the massive front door, she could see the approach of not one but two coaches, their polished black surfaces reflecting the gray sky like mirrors. Clara's heart began to pound so hard she was sure it would burst, but she forced herself to continue dusting the marble statue of some long-dead Thornfield ancestor, her movements steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. The massive front door opened with its characteristic groan, and suddenly Lord Thornfield was there, stepping into his ancestral home with the easy confidence of someone who belonged everywhere he went. 3 months in London had not changed him. He was still tall and dark and magnetic, still capable of making the air itself seem charged with electricity. But there was something different about him, something Clara couldn't quite identify until she realized what it was. He looked tired, as if the social whirl of London had drained something essential from him. Behind him came the Pembertons, Lord Pemberton round and jovial, Lady Pemberton tall and elegantly dressed, and between them a young woman who could only be Lady Sarah. She was beautiful in the way that money and breeding always produced, with golden hair arranged in the latest fashion, and a traveling dress that probably cost more than Clara would earn in a lifetime. When she laughed at something Lord Thornfield said, the sound was like silver bells, musical and perfectly modulated. Clara kept her eyes fixed on her dusting, but she was acutely aware of every word, every gesture, every interaction between the lord of the manor and his guests. She saw how Lady Sarah's hand rested on Lord Thornfield's arm with casual intimacy, how her parents looked on with obvious approval, how Lady Catherine appeared at the top of the grand staircase like a fairy godmother blessing an already perfect union. "Welcome home, darling," Lady Catherine called, her voice warm with genuine affection as she descended the stairs in a rustle of silk and satisfaction. "I trust the journey from London wasn't too tiresome?" "Not at all," Lord Thornfield replied, and Clara's heart clenched at the familiar sound of his voice. "The roads were excellent, and the company was—" He paused, his eyes scanning the assembled servants until they found Clara, still frozen by the marble statue with her dusting cloth in her hand. For a moment that lasted an eternity, their gazes locked across the vast expanse of the front hall. Clara saw recognition in his dark eyes, followed by something that might have been surprise, or pleasure, or pain. She couldn't tell which. What she could see was the way his attention shifted completely away from Lady Sarah and the Pembertons, the way his entire focus narrowed to her face as if she were the only person in the room. The intensity of that gaze made her knees weak and her breathing shallow, and she had to grip the statue's marble base to keep from swaying. "The company was delightful," Lord Thornfield finished, though his eyes never left Clara's face. "Absolutely delightful." Lady Sarah followed his gaze and noticed Clara for the first time, her perfect features arranging themselves into an expression of polite confusion. "Oh," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of surprise. "I didn't realize there were servants about. Should we perhaps move to the drawing-room?" The suggestion broke the spell, and Lord Thornfield finally looked away from Clara, his expression settling back into the polite mask of a gracious host. "Of course," he said smoothly. "How thoughtless of me to keep you standing in the hall. Catherine, would you be so kind as to show our guests to their rooms? I'm sure they'd like to refresh themselves before dinner." As the group moved toward the staircase, Clara caught Lady Catherine's eye and saw something there that made her blood run cold. It was a look of calculation mixed with malicious satisfaction, as if she had just witnessed something that confirmed her worst suspicions. Clara's hands began to tremble as she realized what Lady Catherine had seen, the way Lord Thornfield had looked at her, the way his attention had fixed on her face with unmistakable intensity, the way he had forgotten his guest's existence for those few charged moments. The implications were terrifying. Lady Catherine now had evidence of exactly the kind of inappropriate attachment she had been warning against, proof that Clara had somehow managed to capture Lord Thornfield's attention despite every effort to remain invisible. And Clara knew with sickening certainty that Lady Catherine would use this knowledge against her in ways she couldn't even imagine. But even as fear turned her blood to ice water, Clara couldn't quite regret what had happened. For those few seconds, she had seen something in Lord Thornfield's eyes that looked like recognition, like joy, like homecoming. Even if it led to her destruction, even if it confirmed every one of Lady Catherine's poisonous predictions, Clara would treasure that moment for the rest of her life. She finished her dusting with mechanical precision and retreated to the servants' quarters to await whatever consequences would follow. Through her tiny window, she could see the moors stretching away toward the horizon, wild and free and utterly indifferent to the human dramas playing out within Thornfield Manor's ancient walls. Soon, she thought, she might be walking across those moors for the last time, carrying her few possessions in a bundle and trying to figure out how to survive in a world that had no place for girls like her. But until that moment came, she would hold fast to the memory of Lord Thornfield's eyes finding hers across a crowded room, and the way his voice had softened when he spoke of delightful company while looking straight at her face. If this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes, what hurts in us is what makes us most human.